Hi, everyone, and welcome to our next case, Hammer versus Dagenhart. As always, make sure for the next exam you understand the facts, what the issue is, how the issue gets resolved, what holding does the court reach, and then the reasoning. Why did it reach that conclusion? What rules did it use, and what theories of interpretation? Okay, so what do we need to know? In 1916, Congress passes a law that is trying to ban child labor. But the way that they're going about banning child labor seems very sort of like Commerce Clause oriented because Congress, the federal government, has to point to one of the powers in Article 1, Section 8 to justify its actions. So the way the law worked was if you manufactured goods using children under the age of 14 or children ages 14 to 16 who work a ton of hours, right? Then it's against federal law to ship those goods across state lines in order to sell them. And, this basically is saying, look, if you're, a small business and all of your sales occur within the state, good for you. And your state legislature allows child labor, fine. You can do whatever you want. But at the point where you are trying to become a nationally sort of recognized business, then we've got a problem. And the reason part of so the reasons behind cracking down on child labor are multifold. I mean, one is it's just a really immoral thing to force children to have to do. But the bigger problem was child labor was a conscious strategy used by southern states to try to make them their industries more competitive with better established northern industries. Because the Industrial Revolution took off a little earlier and to a greater extent in the North, and this was part of the way of the South trying to catch up. They would underpay black workers, and they would rely on child labor. And if you pay your workers less, that means the goods can be cheaper and you can compete against the better organized northern businesses. And so again, like if you're a small business somewhere in the South, Congress isn't trying to regulate you. But if you are trying to ship your goods across state lines to compete with northern factories, and northern states have gotten rid of child labor, um, then it's like that's unfair competition, and Congress wanted to shut that down. So Roland Dagenhart was the father of two boys who worked at a North Carolina cotton mills, and he sued. And I mean, this is what we're talking about in terms of like, I mean, look at how freaking dangerous this is. These kids have no shoes on, right? There's equipment going, you know, on all around them. They could very easily get hurt. You can see how big this factory is, and yet, despite how big it is, we see one window, right, to bring in some fresh air and stuff like that. I mean, it's uh, yeah, it was very very difficult. And then of course the other main way in which children were employed was as farm workers, where yeah, that's cotton, and everybody out in the cotton fields is going to get pricked up in their hands, and it's really tedious because those blossoms are so small. It's very very arduous and difficult work. So there like I said, there are a whole bunch of different reasons. There are economic competition reasons, but also sort of moral reasons why you would want to curtail this practice. So what's the issue in this case? It's whether a federal law prohibiting the interstate transportation of goods produced by child labor violates the Commerce Clause. And what you end up with is a 5-4 decision written by Justice Day saying that yes, it was a violation of the Commerce Clause because you this wasn't a valid attempt to regulate the economy. Instead, what it was trying to regulate how the goods get produced. And the production of goods only occurs within one state. Unless you have some weird factory that's like half in Maryland and half in Tennessee, right, straddling the Mason-Dixon line, right, the production of goods is limited to one factory, which is wholly located in one state. So if there was ever going to be an entity of government that regulates the production of goods, it would have to be a state government. And so you end up getting reasons about how this really wasn't about regulating commerce and how it violated the 10th Amendment as well. So, but it wasn't quite as like clear cut for this conservative majority. The conservative majority had some, they had to wiggle their way out of some precedents that suggested that what the federal government was doing was perfectly valid. And it's really important that you guys understand these cases that I'm about to list, because it's if you want to understand what the court did in Hammer, the whole like takeaway message is how this conservative majority ended up drawing a line between times where the federal government acted in a way that seemed to impinge on state rights versus the child labor law. So the federal government basically argued in this case that so long as the regulation targets anything to do with interstate commerce, that law has to be upheld by the courts. Now, like the, if the child labor ban was upheld, would that have improved public health, safety, welfare, morality? Yes, right? But that's not necessarily a problem. Normally, we would think that the federal government can't justify something in terms of public health, safety, welfare, morality. Those powers belong to the states, and it might be a problem if the federal government comes to one conclusion about public morality and the state of North Carolina, for instance, has a different understanding. And to let the federal law trump the state law means that the federal government is impinging on the state's ability to make that sort of police powers judgment. But the federal government's argument in court in this case was like, no, it's commerce. The goal of the regulation can be whatever Congress wants, so long as what it is targeting is interstate commerce. And when you have goods being shipped across state lines that are about to be bought and sold, that triggers Congress's jurisdiction, and it can, as we learned in Gibbons versus Ogden, it can exercise that power to the utmost extent. And sort of the single best control over that is, if the voters don't like it, they should vote in someone else. And in fact, that argument about like, yeah, the federal government can kind of sort of look like they're doing police powers things so long as they're legitimately targeting interstate commerce, that was backed up by 4 different precedents. The first is Champion versus Ames. Then you have Hippolyte Egg, Hoke versus United States, and then Clark Distilling. And each of these cases involved the federal government acting and targeting interstate commerce, but doing so in a way that makes it look like they're trying to promote like public health or safety, welfare, or morality. And the other way in which all of these cases have something in common is you have a consensus in many states, but not all states, to eliminate a practice. So like for child labor, most of the states have gotten rid of child labor, but not all of them, right? And then, so let's go through Champion versus Ames. So Champion versus Ames was a federal law banning the interstate transportation of lottery tickets. And this was clearly a sort of public morality kind of goal, thinking that gambling is immoral. But the fact that those lottery tickets were items that were being shipped across state lines to be bought triggered Congress's jurisdiction. And believe it or not, I mean, the United States has gotten so into gambling in the last few years. Conservative Christian groups had been working throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And in fact, it was oftentimes some of the same people who were working to get rid of alcohol were also looking to get rid of state-sponsored gambling activities. And they had convinced every single state in the country to get rid of their state-run lottery except one. New York. And New York was more than happy to be the only state in the 48 states at the time to be printing and selling lottery tickets. Why? Because not only could the state of New York sell to a bunch of New Yorkers, but they could sell all over the country, right? And so, like, let's say you're Alabama and you had banned lottery tickets for like 30 years, and yet you keep noticing that people have lottery tickets. And it's like, well, how is this happening? Well, because they were purchasing them through the mail to get them from New York. And so, the argument here is that New York's decision to regulate public morality one way undermines the ability of all the other states to regulate public morality in the opposite way. Because if you really think that gambling is immoral, you need to get rid of the lottery tickets. And that means both getting rid of the lottery tickets bought and sold in your home state, but also the lottery tickets that are being shipped in from other states. And New York was making that part of the pursuing that goal very difficult. You get a slightly different thing in Hippolyte Egg. So Hippolyte Egg versus United States upheld President Theodore Roosevelt's one of his big accomplishments, the Pure Food and Drug Act. And it prohibited the interstate transportation of certain kinds of foods and drugs that were viewed as dangerous. It's also, it's a pretty important law because we still, it's still relevant to modern American life, right? So, like modern product labeling, that first became a thing through this law, 120 years ago. It also forbade businesses from trying to cover up the health hazards or a damaged product, that sort of thing, and it created an agency that eventually became the Food and Drug Administration. So the problem was that these sort of huckster businesses selling snake oil and calling it a cure for cancer or whatever. It was more, I think, sort of the drugs problem. Although this was the early days of trying to mass produce food in cans and stuff like that. And so I'm sure there were more than a few hucksters that were trying to sell tainted food for a profit. And the problem, why wouldn't you want to do this state by state as opposed to having one federal law? Man, if you've got the railroads, you can ship canned foods and you can ship drugs all over the country. And so one company's bad behavior could pose a threat not just to the people in that company's home state, but all across the country. And so it requires more of a national solution. It's not so much that the people of Alabama wanted their constituents to get sick and die of tainted foods and drugs. It's just the most efficient way to solve that problem is for a federal law, especially when the railways can make sure that goods get shipped all over the place. So even if it's only a couple of companies that are doing things bad, they can affect people all over the place. Okay, so the last two cases. Hoke versus the United States upheld the Mann Act, which was also known as the White Slave Traffic Act, and it prohibited the interstate transportation of sex workers, which really, this law was passed in reaction to some sort of hysterical, over exaggeration in the news about the extent of sex trafficking in the country. But I think it was around this time that Nevada was thinking of legalizing prostitution in part of its state, and so maybe Congress, I don't know, had a legitimate grounds to act, but it's pretty clear that what they were looking to crack down on was a particular understanding of public morality. But because sex work involves the exchange of money for services, that's what triggered Congress's jurisdiction, and the Supreme Court upheld that law in Hoke versus the United States. And then finally, you have Clark Distilling, which the Congress, before it passed the 18th Amendment creating prohibition, it passed a federal law banning the interstate transportation of booze because, again, a bunch of states before prohibition had decided on a state level to get rid of booze. But that means you don't just shut down Peter Mugler's brewery. You also have to make sure that booze from out of state isn't making its way into Kansas. So again, right, like so, states can ban prostitution, but they can't prevent its citizens from traveling across state lines, going to Nevada to seek it out. States can ban the sale of booze from but it's hard to be effective if out of state booze sneaks in. So how do we end up with a problem of holdout states, right? Where you have most states think one way, but a few states are holding out and are trying to regulate things the opposite way, right? So this was as much about like north south and economics as it was about protecting children, right? As I sort of alluded to earlier, northern states tended to restrict child labor, southern states tended not to. And this was to make southern goods cheaper and more competitive. And they were already going off of an established playbook of paying African Americans less than white workers. And so, part of the argument here is, and this gets back to Gibbons versus Ogden and McCulloch versus Maryland as well, which is like, what is what's the point of the federal government? Because remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government was so weak that individual states had their own currency. Going down to Virginia for the weekend, you better exchange your money. And individual states also had trade treaties with foreign countries. And so you had different states trying to undercut each other. And so part of the logic in creating the Constitution and giving Congress the Commerce Clause was to prevent certain parts of the country economically from, kneecapping other parts of the country. And so, even if you want to leave morality out of this, there's certainly good economic reasons to promote fair competition that would justify Congress's action here. But that's not how Justice Day saw it. What he ends up sort of arguing was that the court was perfectly fine to uphold the ban on lotteries, the ban on unsafe food and drinks, the ban on sex workers, and the ban on alcohol, but it would be wrong to uphold the Child Labor Act. Why? Because in Champion, Hippolyte Egg, Hoke, and Clark Distilling, the use of interstate transportation was necessary to accomplish the accomplishment of harmful results, right? If you what they're really doing is keeping unsafe or immoral things from reaching other parts of the country. So targeting the transportation is really important because otherwise you'll still have lottery tickets, showing up in all different states. You'd still have illegal booze showing up, right? And meanwhile, children are used they're working in textile mills, they're working in the cotton fields, and the quality of the textiles, the quality of the cotton that's harvested doesn't depend on whether or not children are used. It's the same kind of logic that the court had in Lochner when they said clean and wholesome bread does not depend upon whether the baker works but 10 hours a day or 60 hours a week, right? And so, if this isn't, this is just punishing businesses that operate in certain states where the state government has chosen a different route on child labor. And but Day feels like he has to respond to the notion that there's unfair competition between the South and the North, and his answer is that the Child Labor Act isn't the answer. Instead, the best way to understand it is an invasion by the federal power of the control of a matter purely local in its character. The fact that the states are squabbling over child labor, according to Day, that's the way the Constitution was supposed to be designed. That different states do things differently. That's why we don't have just one level of government. And if we let the federal government swoop in and regulate how goods are produced, then the ability for states to control purely local matters may be eliminated entirely. Because remember, this case isn't just about child labor, it's about letting the federal government stick its nose in um, kind of any way it wants. Because today it might be child labor, tomorrow it might be the federal government bans the interstate transportation of goods produced in states where people are denied the right to vote on too harshly or whatever, right? And like there are all sorts of ways where the federal government could try and take decisions that are properly given to the states away from them. Just like in Lochner, we get another dissenting opinion from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. And Holmes is mad. I mean, he was mad in Lochner. He was mad in Adkins versus Children's Hospital. I think he's at his most grumpy in this case. He says basically, like, one of his points is like, what about Gibbons versus Ogden do you not understand? Like, it's interstate commerce. And where Congress has the right to act, it has the right to act however it wants. Its power is in unqualified terms. And here's the funny thing. So, like, the reason I portray Holmes as a grump is, that's partly an accurate reflection of the way he writes, but it also has to do with the fact that as a young man, he fought in the Civil War, and he got shot like 3 times, and one of the times, like, the bullet stayed in his body. It would have killed him to like figure out where the bullet was and remove it. And so this is like almost 60 years later. And if you've been like carrying around war wounds, including a bullet staying in you for 60 years, yeah, I think it's okay if you're a little grumpy. I think I would be too. And so Holmes's whole dissent in Lochner was around like, I don't know if this bakery law is a good one or not. All I know is that the majority is acting like a bunch of unprincipled libertarians. But here he actually does sort of embrace the notion behind child labor. He goes, if there's any matter upon which civilized countries have agreed, it is the evil of premature and excessive child labor. I should have thought that if we were to introduce our own moral conceptions, where in my opinion they don't belong, in other words, judges shouldn't be basing decisions on morality, this was preeminently a case for upholding the exercise of all its powers by the United States. In other words, like, if I ever was going to get sort of political in one of my decisions, it would be to protect children from exploitation in the workplace. But he doesn't even need this argument, right? Because it's commerce. And in Gibbons versus Ogden, they say it's complete within itself, may be exercised to the utmost extent, and acknowledges no limitations. So yeah, you don't even need to consider what's going on. Okay, so what do you need to know for the exam? You really need to focus on how the court distinguishes this case from the other cases involving lottery tickets and so on and so forth. And I think you need to be able to explain the logic behind Justice Holmes's argument about how once you've invoked the Commerce Clause, it can be for whatever reason the government wants, and if it sounds like a stupid reason, then elect a different set of congressmen. If you can do that, you're going to do great on the exam. I hope this helped. If it didn't, I hope you're asking questions or coming to office hours, and I will talk to you all next time. Thanks.